This time on Poll Hub, we're switching it up. A not too serious first segment that is perfect for this Groundhog Day. Is it Groundhogs or Groundhog Day? We're going to say Groundhog Day. Then a much more serious segment on journalism from the standpoint of journalists. We're speaking with Marist Professor Kevin Lerner about new data and what it might mean. And we finish with a segment about intelligence, human and otherwise. So let's see if you're smart enough to guess what the question is. Stick around, a lot to get to. And hi, everybody. Welcome to Poll Hub. I'm JD Dapper.
I'm Mary Griffith.
I'm Rebecca Hendricks.
And I am Lee Maringoff.
Well, listeners of our podcast know that Lee is not a big fan of making predictions. However, today is a day for predictions, that is, thanks to our good friend Punxsutawney Phil. It is Groundhog Day. However, Phil's track record is a little bit questionable, which makes me wonder if he were a politician, if this were his approval rating, what would this mean for the future of, well, Jay, why don't you pick up from there?
That was good. That is a good way to get this in the mix. Yeah. So yeah, it's Groundhog Day, and Athen, one of our producers, thought what an interesting story to look at because we think of it kind of as a joke, right? I mean, Groundhog Day, whatever, they made a great movie about it. But there's actually some science behind this. There's surveys behind this. There's data behind this. And so we've dug all that out. And Punxsutawney Phil, did you know how long, Lee, do you know how long Punxsutawney Phil has been around? Not the actual, I mean, there's been a lot of them, but the institution. Do you know how long it's been around?
I'm going like 80 to 100 years, something.
Yeah, the 1880s.
Wow.
Punxsutawney Phil has been, or somebody's been pulling a groundhog up and calling it Punxsutawney Phil since the 1880s. So in that time, since the 1880s, he's predicted 108 more winters and 20 early springs. Good rate of accuracy. Yeah. According to a study from the Storm Facts Almanac, his accuracy is 39%. According to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, which is the National Weather Service, over the past decade or so, he's been about 40% accurate. So he goes about 4 out of 10. Now, I would say that's not such a great rate of accuracy, but then when we look at the weather forecasts, I mean, who's calling who what? So do you, Lee, when you see this kind of fun stuff, does he guess in it? But then you see that he's actually got about a 40% accuracy, which isn't all that terrible. What do you think about that?
Well, in politics, we'd also now look at the somewhat accurate, because that's become a new category of great. See, I can turn anything into politics, you know. Look at a topic like this, and I should tell you that my mother's birthday was February 2nd. And so we used to have a joke in our house that she would go outside, and if she saw her well, you get the rest of the gist. So we didn't actually rely on the meteorologists at all on this. But approval rating, you know, if maybe you're doing 50-50 by just guessing, I would think that 39-40% not so good as a measurement, as an accuracy. But then again, meteorologists, wrong a lot. The seismologists, the ones who do the earthquakes, not so hot. But the cephologists, those who study public opinion, boy, we're much better than that. You start with 50-50, and you just have to add a little to be on the majority right.
Mary, that's why we have this segment, is to prove how accurate we are as compared to a groundhog, I think. That's
very important. Well, no, not that comparison. But, you know, I think what was really interesting and funny from Athens' research is that there are other animals that have been used to predict the oncoming of spring. And, I mean, I have to smile when I see this. In Concord, Ohio, a cat named Casimir predicts the weather based on how sloppily he eats a dinner, and that dinner consists of pierogies. In Oklahoma, at the Oklahoma City Zoo, there are, I believe, twin bear brothers who predict the weather by choosing a box of treats. And in California, Palm Desert, there's a tortoise named Mojave Maxine who predicts spring by when she comes out of her den. And fun fact that I've learned is that the reptilian equivalent to hibernation is called brumation. Now, what came to my mind is that if we're basing the weather and the oncoming of spring based on these types of events, I mean, I could make a killing for my kids based on how sloppily, they eat or whether, which treat they pick. So,
hey, you could be a TikTok star with them. Maybe you should get on that, right? That'd be good.
No
What are
comment,
the
Jay.
which are the animals who kind of like when it rains? Is it cows that kind of get together and sort of they're just? I should have the answer to this, but there's an animal that you look at and you say, "Boy, it's going to rain," because they know what it's all about. No,
I
Nobody.
don't know about that. They do say that birds, before earthquakes, animals know that. There's
Yes.
been, there's some signs of that. So, but Lee, when you were a kid, I heard less about Punxsutawney Phil, and I don't know if this is a generational thing, and more about the Farmer's Almanac. Was that true for you too?
I would say so, but I didn't put much stock in either of
Yeah.
them because I knew if I had Yankee tickets, it was likely to rain that day. So that's a whole other mode of prediction if you're a kid.
So that's another one. If you could still do that, you can get on TikTok and be a star with that. Well, it turns out the Farmer's Almanac, did you know there's two Farmer's Almanac? This is more of
I did not know that
Athens
either.
research. There's a Farmer's Almanac and an old Farmer's Almanac. And NPR did this great story about a decade ago, in depth, looking at all this. And they're no more reliable than anybody else. They did point out one thing, though, which is interesting, because if you think about Punxsutawney Phil, does he see a shadow or not? It's binary, yes or no. The Farmer's Almanac is, for the week of January, whatever, it's going to be mainly sunny and chilly. So if it's mainly sunny and chilly on one day, are they right? And the rest of the week's terrible? Does it have to be all 5 days? So it was a really interesting story about how predictions and prognostications, how, I think it's the same thing if you go to a medium. They only have to get in your direction of being right before you go, oh, wow, they really know what they're talking about. So I don't know.
Nailed it. They
Yeah.
nailed it. The old, it's attributed to Yogi Berra, but it's really not. It was actually Casey Stengel, the old professor and manager of the Yankees, used to say it's very difficult making predictions, especially about the future. And so I think that sort of gets into where we're going on this. Mary, I have a question for you and Jay, and I bet you guys know the answer, and I don't remember the answer. Which mayor was it? Was it de Blasio or Bloomberg who murdered Punxsutawney Phil?
Well, it wasn't Punxsutawney Phil.
No, it was Staten Island Chuck, I believe. And I think we need to use the term murder, carefully, Lee.
Yeah. Well, it wasn't first degree. It wasn't premeditated. What happened? Was it self-defense? I mean, what happened?
Yeah, so Staten Island Chuck also, I think, bit Mayor Bloomberg, another different Staten Island Chuck. But yeah, de Blasio and the woodchuck, it didn't end well. Let's just leave it at that. Hey, I've got a question now.
For de Blasio or the woodchuck?
For the woodchuck. Although de Blasio didn't get a lot of good press out of that, so it didn't end well for him either. It was a lose-lose. So before we go to the next segment, this is being recorded on Wednesday, so it's actually not technically Groundhog Day. But as you're listening to this, it is Groundhog Day. So let's see how good we are at predicting the future. Lee, will he see his shadow or not?
Wow, boy, pressure. I'd almost rather do an election than that. I'm going for shadow.
Mary?
I'm also going with shadow.
Hey, Athens, since this is your segment, pop on your microphone. Shadow, no shadow. Punxsutawney Phil.
Well, seeing as in the past 100 years, he's predicted 100 winters and 20 springs, I'm going to go for winter again. I think he's going to stick with his record.
Okay. And I'm going to say he is not going to see his shadow. So there we go.
What?
We will see next week. We'll add that up and we'll tally up the tail of the tape and see how good we are. If we're any better than Punxsutawney Phil at predicting spring and winter continuing.
Did you say this was a more lighter topic than
I
we
did.
started with? Okay, well, there is some truth in advertising after all.
Extra, extra. Read all about it. The news industry has taken some big hits in the last week. The Messenger just today, Sports Illustrated, the LA Times, Business Insider, and Time Magazine have all made large cuts to their staffs or closed down in the case of the Messenger as ad revenue has crashed.
Yeah, the news industry seems to be in pretty big trouble in America. It's hard to make a profit, and plenty of Americans don't have much trust in what journalists do. Jay, as a career journalist, how do you feel about all of these layoffs going on?
There's been boom and bust cycles in journalism for a long time, but there's really been nothing quite like this. I worked in local news for a long time, and local news is decimated. Many towns, many even small cities don't have a daily newspaper anymore. or even a news organization with like a website. And all of these closures, these are big institutions. The LA Times, I mean, it's a major American paper. And if the LA Times and the Washington Post, which has been hemorrhaging money, if they can't figure out how to make money doing journalism, I don't know where we have journalism. I think it's very worrying.
Yeah, it's definitely concerning. Going into the journalism field, you're kind of wondering, where are the jobs? Where are we going to find places to work if we're shutting down and kind of constricting their staff? So
yeah,
it's definitely concerning.
When I got out of grad school, there was a bit of a recession. I was the last person in my grad school class to get a job, and I heard a lot about, well, we're not hiring right now, but they were hiring. There were news organizations. So yeah, you're graduating this year, and I'm not going to sugarcoat it. It's tough. It's definitely a tough market or a tough career to be going into right now because there's so much uncertainty.
So Jay, we already mentioned what Americans think about journalism, but what do journalists think about the current state of journalism? According to polls conducted by Pew in 2022, 41% of Americans believe that the press is covering the most important stories of the day. Compare that with 67% of journalists who believe the same. And that's just the start of the divide. Professor Kevin Lerner, an associate professor of communication and journalism and the chair of the Department of Communication at Marist College, who is studying the history of the press.
I think there is a divide between the way journalists see themselves and what they do and the way that the news-consuming public sees journalists.
Indeed, a 2022 Gallup poll shows that only 34% of Americans have a great deal or fair amount of confidence in the media to report the news fairly and accurately. But 38% said they have no trust at all in the news media.
I think people trust the things they can see more than they trust the things they don't understand. Any process that feels opaque or out of view is the kind of thing that's open to conspiracy and speculation. And so I think that the more work that journalists can do out in public, the better.
So let's go back to, what do journalists think of their profession? In 2022, Pew asked journalists an open-ended question. What does the news industry do the worst? The top response? Getting the story right, with 23% of U.S. journalists saying so.
And, there's evidence that the public agrees. Remember those Pew polls we mentioned a minute ago? Well, 35% of Americans felt that news organizations did a very good or somewhat good job of reporting the news accurately. And what did journalists say in that same poll? 66% said they thought their profession did a very good or somewhat good job of getting the story right. That is a huge gap in perception.
I don't think that the news is getting things wrong most of the time. Individual journalists, as reporters, are feeling a push to be first as opposed to right. And some of that it's consumer pressure. Some of it is pressure from editors who want to make sure they beat the competition. But I suspect that's more of a perception than a reality among journalists. I think that the vast majority of news that is coming out of what we call legacy news organizations is still true. Now, whether that's coming from a particular point of view is different, but I think that the facts are largely correct.
Here, Dr. Lerner mentions point of view, right? And that's another name for bias. And bias combined with partisanship was the second most mentioned concern of journalists about their industry. In fact, bias in news media is a huge topic of discussion today as we talk about echo chambers and propaganda and fake news. 75% of journalists told Pew that they thought it's a major problem when people with the same political views get their news from the same news organizations.
I think that the public has a tendency to pick a team and stick with it and trust the group that they follow because they see the news organization that they trust as trustworthy, right? They get all their news from it. They're used to hearing things a particular way, and anything that sort of challenges that point of view can be discarded. Over the last 100 years or so, the press in America has gotten itself into a place where it has professed this kind of fairness, balance, and people use the word objectivity a lot, though that's a really complicated idea. And I think that the public has come to expect that from the press and sort of demands it. And I don't think that it has ever been an ideal that the press in America has been able to achieve, some kind of pure objectivity and equal time for everybody.
Yeah, but in a world where MAGA supporters pretty much only get their news from Newsmax, Fox, or Breitbart, and progressives pretty much only get their news from places like MSNBC or Daily Kos, is it even possible to report the news in a way that everybody or most people think is accurate? Pew showed that 52% of journalists think it is not possible, and 62% of Americans agree this is just not possible. Dr. Lerner, he's not surprised.
Last week before, I got to judge the National Magazine Awards, and the National Magazine Award judging guidelines, they joke in this. There's a funny line in the guidelines, but they say, remember, you are judging magazines that appeal to everybody, not just to people who live in Brooklyn and Montclair, New Jersey. And there is something about that because a lot of journalists live in the brownstone areas of Brooklyn and Montclair, New Jersey, and work for the New York Times. And you see a particular worldview when you do that, right? And so the New York Times, while it is, I would say it is attempting to get the facts right all of the time, is a news organization that, if it doesn't have a bias, it has a point of view. And that is an institutional center-left newspaper for well-educated, well-off consumers. And that's who they are. And I think in general, they would do a better job of connecting with a broader group of people if they admitted that, rather than just saying, no, we are the news for everybody.
Okay, well, I'm thoroughly depressed. Not only do journalists and Americans both feel the news industry has trust and bias problems, but the economic issues that we started with are truly an existential crisis for journalism as it's been practiced in America for over 100 years. So does Dr. Lerner think there's any possibility of a good ending here?
Journalism is going to survive. I have no doubt that journalism is going to survive, but the media industry is going to look very different. By the time my students graduate and enter the workforce, it's going to be different from what it was when they entered college, right? I mean, 4 years is enough time for seismic change right now. And what that means is that people who grew up, say somebody who's in their 70s now, somebody born in the baby boom generation, they've had almost exactly the same mix of media for their entire lives, right? From the post-World War II era with the rise of television and national newscasts, Walter Cronkite on the CBS Evening News, the rise of national newspapers, there's been one media ecosystem that they've been very used to. But since 2000 or so, as the internet has changed the way that news is gathered and news is delivered, and news organizations have nationalized and moved to the coasts, that's very disorienting, I think, to people who have lived their entire lives with that media system.
Well, as a journalism student graduating in 4 months, I have a vested interest in trying to figure out where the industry is going at this point. Print is long gone, and even TV news seems to be the past. But can journalism survive with just websites and social media?
Many journalists have been good at using social media for connecting more directly with news consumers, right? Individual bylines have become much more accessible because you can interact with those people on social media. This was particularly true in the peak years of what used to be known as Twitter, when Twitter was really where the news media gathered. Although, again, a lot of the groups that follow those journalists are self-selecting. They're the people who were already following those news organizations. But individual reporters and their bylines do feel more accessible in a way that makes it feel like you can know those journalists in the way that we were talking about before, where many people don't know particular journalists. So even if they live in Washington, D.C., you might be able to interact with them on Twitter. So I think that is a seismic change. And I think it's actually probably a good change because it makes those reporters more transparent. You can see their process sometimes. And social media can also be a reporting tool for those reporters.
Transparent. You remember earlier when Dr. Lerner said that people might be more trusting of things that they understand? Do you think that journalists tweeting helps us do that?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, his point, I think, is well taken, that people don't really understand the process of journalism. And I used to face that all the time. People thought that journalists like myself came into a story knowing exactly what we were going to do. Here's the story, and I'm going to write it. It's like, well, no, you're coming into the story going, okay, I don't know any of the facts. Let's talk to people and find out what the facts are. And the story comes from that. The story that you report comes from your reporting. And I don't think a lot of people understand that process. I don't know that journalists being on social media, and I'll be honest, this did not exist when I left the industry, right? Social media was just getting started. Nobody was on Twitter when I left the industry, but I don't know that that really helps. I mean, when you look at your social media feed and you see journalists in there, does that give you more confidence in them as professionals, or does it make it seem like they're more like everybody else?
I have to say that seeing journalists on my feed, seeing their names, seeing their work that they're attached to, I get a better sense for the kind of quality of work that they put out. I think when I used to just open the New York Times app on my phone and read many articles a day by any person from that works at the New York Times that has contributed to the New York Times, I wasn't really taking into account that person, their writing style, and their point of view, their perspective. But now that I'm able to follow them and read their articles as kind of their own portfolio of work, I have a better understanding for where they're coming from and the way that they write and the kind of bias that they're going to put on things. And I think that that can be extremely helpful. I also think that podcasting, what we're doing here, has shown a lot of people what journalists do. I think that, back in 2014 with the popularization of Serial, I think that people really understood what was going on in that podcast because they heard the interviews on tape. And I think that these kind of new forms, podcasting, social media, videos on TikTok or on YouTube, I think that it does help people visualize the job of a journalist.
So you just mentioned TikTok, and for anybody of my generation, the idea that there's any news on TikTok is kind of incredible. Like, how could there be news on TikTok when you're just flipping through, everything is very short and there's people with, masks and dancing and doing whatever. And, and then all of a sudden there's news. How do you get news from TikTok? I mean, this is the world you're going into there, where people in your generation, this is one of the places they get news. How do you foresee if you're going to be a journalist, how do you foresee practicing journalism in a world where your generation is getting at least some of its news on a platform like TikTok?
I see myself making kind of a modern news package. To put that into perspective, I think that we used to make a package and it would be a written story, a TV broadcast segment, and maybe an audio segment for radio.
Yeah.
If your company had all of those things.
Right.
So CNN has a website, you run an article, you also run it on TV, and you might run a short audio clip. I think today the news package might look like making a YouTube video that's 5 minutes long and horizontal, and it might look like making a vertical video that is 1 minute long for TikTok, and maybe writing an article, maybe just writing a tweet. Honestly, I think that people are shifting towards video and audio forms of news these days, and I think that we're having to create new forms of news package.
It's funny because when you just mentioned the idea of a 5 minute this and a 1 minute that and audio and all that, I mean, that is what organizations are doing. What is that about choice? And I guess what I'm asking is, there's a lot of people lamenting, and have been for 100 years. It's like when TV news came along, people lamented, oh, there's no depth to it. There's nothing there. People aren't reading the story. All they're getting is a very skim kind of thing. Well, talking about a skim, like a tweet is like the ultimate skim. But the argument was, if people were really interested, they'll go read that article in the New York Times. They'll go read that article in the New Yorker, or nowadays on a Substack site or something. Do you think people in your generation think of news that way? So they see something on TikTok, if they're really interested, they're going to go dive deeper.
I do think that, actually. I think that People want news to be accessible to them on TikTok. If it's something that they're not interested in, I think they at the very least want to be aware of it. I think that a lot of us, browse the headlines and we don't always click into the article, but we know that it's happening because we saw the headline. And I think that that's kind of a similar thing that's happening on TikTok. I think that you can get across a point pretty succinctly in a short video, but I also think that people are still interested in diving deeper. People are interested in looking up an article and reading it. People are interested in looking at what a journalist is saying on their Twitter, on their Instagram, and maybe a longer form post. And I think people are interested in watching longer form videos. I think that we're seeing documentaries being very popular these days. I think that long form video content on YouTube is probably the most profitable form of YouTube content. Videos that are literally 1 hour to sometimes 5 to 10 hours long are extremely popular on the platform. So I think people still do have an interest.
You watch 10-hour
I sure do.
on YouTube? Really? 10 hours?
I sure do.
Wow.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I don't think we can solve all the issues, but and certainly the economic one is the big elephant in the room, is how no matter what platform you're on, how do you make money? And that's something that I think is getting worked out. But I mean, I do have a better sense, I think, after hearing from Dr. Lerner and talking with you. I think I have a little bit better sense that there's a path forward here if they can figure out, if you, going into this world can figure out how it can make enough money to support people, because people have to get paid, people got to feed families. It's not a charity, but it's super valuable information that people want. How do people pay for it? I think that's, the thing that is the question that's still hanging out there.
Yeah, well, I hope we find a way.
Well, we've had fun and we've had serious, and now we're going to end again with our fun fact, as we always do, in the question from the CBS News from 2018. Which of the following animals do you think is the most intelligent? I'm looking down and we don't have humans in here, so I think we're kind of like not biasing this. But your choices are dolphins, dogs, elephants, and cats. And the answer is in that order. Dolphins at 48, dogs at 29. I don't buy that. Elephants at, I believe it says 16 or 18, 16. And cats at 4. And don't know is only 1%. So people know, apparently, what this all is about. Dolphins, I get it. They have the reputation. But I've seen some awfully intelligent dogs in my time. What do you guys think?
I'm certainly a dog lover, and I think that all of these animals are pretty intelligent. I do have to go with dolphins, Lee. Any animal that has the ability to, has echolocation is a big thing on my end, especially when I can't find my cell phone under, a blanket on the couch and need to follow that sound. But I love dogs. I think they're super smart. I think it also depends on the breed, but I got to go with dolphins.
So there, as always with fun facts, I always, go, well, there's two things that I find interesting. So there's two things I find interesting. In this case, one is that dogs overwhelmingly over cats when you have to pick between the two. Much higher. I agree with
totally.
that. Yeah, and that's easy.
Absolutely.
And then the other is that I think it would have been interesting to include humans, because arguably, just because we kind of have done what we've done to the planet and we think we're the smartest, I don't know if that's necessarily true. Dolphins may be smarter than we are. So I think it would have been interesting to add that. After all, this is a CBS News poll, and we know that, they could have added like mice or snakes, and that would have been in keeping with their answers.
But also, Jay, what about chimpanzees or
right.
gorillas?
Right. Yeah. Actually, I just saw a video of I think it was a minke whale. It's one of those white whales bringing a cell phone that had been dropped off of a whale watching boat up to the boat to return it to the person on the boat. So, yeah, I'm not so sure they're not smarter than we are anyway. So.
Along your lines there, if you're going to talk about destroying versus helping, I mean, there's so much good footage of animals doing what humans wouldn't when there's someone injured and taking care instinctively or maybe a learned behavior. Rebecca, what do you got?
Well, I gotta say, I'm actually pretty shocked that cats are lower than dogs. I think cats are certainly less obedient, but I don't think they're less smart. I think they just care less. But I'm gonna have to go dolphins on this one. Out of these choices, I'm going to have to go with dolphins. They have some form of language recognition. That's pretty huge.
Yeah, that's a big deal. Athen, what do you got?
I would say also dolphins. I've had dogs and cats my entire life, and I don't know. I don't know if they're the most intelligent. I think they can be taught a lot of things, and when they want to get something, they can figure it out. But I think, yeah, with the echolocation, and if you look at videos of like how dolphins communicate with each other, I think they're probably the most intelligent out of this group.
That's a very strong endorsement. Barb's not on today on the podcast, but
What do you
she
think
has
she'd say,
dogs.
Lee? What do you think she'd say?
Oh, she would totally go with dogs, but she would go with an open-ended horses.
Yeah.
Because horses, first of all, her dogs and horses know when feeding time is. They will remind her of that by doing certain things that indicate, it's 4:30. What's going on today? Dogs, as if they had watches, will go to bed at a certain time and disappear. And you say, where are they? Oh, they went to sleep. So they got a lot of things going for them. But I'm going to end this discussion following Mr. Ed. You remember Mr. Ed, the talking horse. Okay, where else could you have that kind of intelligence than Mr. Ed? Really, guys.
Hello, I'm Mr. Ed.
That'll do it for Poll Hub this week.
Poll Hub is produced by the Marist Poll at Marist College in Poughkeepsie, New York.
Mary Griffith is our executive producer. Casey Schaff is our production supervisor.
The Poll Hub team includes Athen Hollis and Rebecca Hendricks.
If you enjoy Poll Hub, please consider leaving a review.
Positive reviews help other listeners like you find us.
If you'd like to learn more about polling and survey science, check out the Marist Poll Academy, our free online learning portal.
If you have questions for us, tweet them at us at Marist Poll.
Remember, you can always tell your smart speaker to play Poll Hub.
And with any luck, it'll cooperate.
Finally, wherever you listen to Poll Hub, there is a subscribe button.
Click it and the latest episode will be ready for you in your podcasting app as soon as it's released.
We'll see you next time.
A horse is a horse, of course, and this one will talk till his voice is hoarse. You never heard of a talking horse?